So I'm going to talk about one of my favorite films, My Dinner with Andre. So first I'm going to first I'm going to say is I'm going to be funny. It's a film. Okay, that was a joke. But it's extremely interesting. You know, the start of the film where you're basically looking at Wally's life. Through his narration at the start, and really it's interesting then later to see the contrast between his life and Andre's life. But also, it's very interesting the contrast where you'd be talking about how much his life is terrible, but then you talk about how he enjoys putting plays on for I think he said like for the community or something. But then I question, does is he even doing that, or maybe he is. Maybe I'm getting too skeptical of him, what he's telling the truth and what he's lying. If he's trying to cover up that he just really doesn't actually feel good and he's pretending that things are good, or is it also like it kind of like is interesting because then it like he talks about that cup. He talks about, oh, that cup of coffee, it feels so good inside, but if there's a dead roach in that coffee, then I don't feel so good or whatever. But so that's very interesting to see the contrast between that a little bit. But if you haven't watched the film, obviously watch the film. But it's very interesting, to hear all the stories that Andre talks about. Uh, you know, things that he did, to teach, but mostly it was to experiment with these art ideas or per like experience type ideas, to experience some type of experience you don't usually experience, to live life a different way, to express yourself a way that you don't usually do in circumstances. But he gets himself into these situations, with these people, which obviously these are not planned, but planned in terms of, there's something they're going to do, but not exactly everything is always planned out with these stories of the situations that he gets himself in. It's not 100% planned in terms of like, this is going to happen and then blah, blah, blah. He doesn't know ahead of time about how things are going to happen. A lot of unpredictable stuff happens to him in these stories. But it's just it's extremely entertaining because it's like listening to like an audiobook of a book that's like really interesting, compelling stories. But also, I think it's because it's not just sticking to one like really long story of like one place. He goes from one place to another place, different characters. So it's interesting, that contrast, and just different topics that get brought up just in the stories that he tells, not even the topics that get brought up when he has the arguments with Wally about, you know, what's the correct choice and if should you be living this way or that way, right? Or what's going on in the world. And but basically, like, it's really interesting. And then, of course, it's interesting. Wally, throughout a certain amount of time, he talks very little. He's more of a listener, and then there's when he finally can participate and he can have a conversation. There's a dialogue. There's a debate or arguments or whatever it may be, but it's just a reaction, right? He's saying what he's thinking. They're both saying what they're thinking, Andre and Wally. So it's interesting to see the two different perspectives, but also makes you think, and you also can learn from Andre's experiences with stories. Realize, you know, should you be doing this? Should you be doing that? Or what I mean, it's like the idea of like, okay, negative and positive, but can you turn negative into a positive? That's the question. But like, what can you learn from it? But also, can certain experiences cause more harm than good? Does it hurt you more than it helps you? But right, so it makes you think about that. But then obviously, it's very interesting to see the contrast of listening and like, yeah, but then he's like, you want to know what I really think of this, right? Because before he, because there's like a moment where he's like, that's really interesting, and then he's like, it's like he's like, you don't think that, right? He says to himself, and he said, you know what I really think about it? And it's very interesting. That's where things get flipped over, and it's so interesting. It's just that at that part in the film, that's where things change in the film. It's and it adds that extra, just extra energy to the film. Um, but it's also interesting to see what the characters say, what it says about themselves, and how they react to what the other person says. How it, you know, both both ways, how it presents what people are, and also there's the conflict that's with the waiter, with this whatever it may be, right? Obviously, we know that it's very intense, things that Andre is talking about, especially in a restaurant, right? Like that, and like all these stories and things that gets into really these topics that are pretty, some things controversial, offensive in some ways, or like very much challenging the way people think. And when he goes ha ha ha, ha, and the waiter's like, "Is everything good?" And that's really conflict of like, right? It's like, but it's like, is he like the waiter isn't like, it's like, but it's really interesting perspectives, and it's like there's ideas like, is this person like powerless, or is it more like this person is like so very, some things are a little conflicting because there's a lot of different ways that you can view this film, and that's what's so interesting about this film is, yeah, that's the best I can do about talking about this film, because I would have to make a better video getting into detail, because sooner or later I'm gonna be like, okay, what am I trying to say? Because I can get into like detail about so much about this film, because you could pick a side or you could not pick a side. You could be against both sides, but be like, it's very much, the one more thing I'll say before the end of this video, it's very much a reflection of society, of, and even the internet, opinions on the internet, and the conversations, and debates, and and in all of these, um just a reflection of even now, even though how many years has been since this film came out. So that's it, that's the end of the video.